Hey guys, Kelade here. Welcome to my patch 8.3 Ny'alotha Dead Waking City Fury Warrior Best in Slot Gear Guide. So there's a couple changes that are happening this patch and this race specifically that kind of change a little bit with what type of gear that we're going for in the upcoming raid. So the biggest thing is that Blizzard has decided to shift and put more power in your gear in the raid sets. So the biggest way that they accomplish this is on the last two bosses, the Carapace of N'alotha and N'alotha the Corruptor. They drop gear that is 10 eye levels higher than every other boss within the raid, right? So what does that mean? That means even the Azerite pieces that are going to drop from N'alotha, for example, is going to be 10 eye levels higher. So instead of the normal 475, it's going to be 485. And basically this makes gearing very easy because these two bosses are going to drop 10 eye levels higher than everything else in the game. And since you can't Warforge and Titan Forge anymore, those are going to be the highest eye level you can get in the game, right? So Mythic rating, the last two bosses will guarantee give you the highest level of anything that's in that slot. So if it's a weapon, bam, this weapon is going to be the highest level. Nothing else is going to beat it, right? So that kind of gives you like some context on the overall aspect. The other thing is that Blizzard nerfed Overwhelming Power to where it's not super OP anymore. Now it's kind of more in line with the other essences in that same row, and it doesn't heavily dictate your Azerite pieces anymore. So once again, freeing up more space for you to just use whatever there is in the Azerite pieces from the last two bosses. On top of that, Blizzard also made another change to Azerite pieces within the raid where they looked at every single spec and they try to pick out the best Azerite that they can put into every single piece. For Fury Warriors, what we got is every single Azerite piece in the raid will have Cold Steel Hot Blood, which is great because that is actually the trait that's best for us, and that's the one that we want 3 out of 3 of. So all those things together, raid Azerite pieces are going to be very, very strong. Now, what does this mean? Mainly, this means you probably don't have to PvP anymore, right? There was that PvP chest that we used to do. You had to get like 2100 rating or 2400 rating if you were doing like within weekly or, you know, the weekly caches or whatever it is. But you don't have to PvP for Azerite pieces anymore. Now, just only PvE content is all you need. Here is the best in slot like gear list. Of course, I'll have a link for this down in the description below. But you can kind of take a look at every single slot where it comes from, right? If it's purple, it's gonna come from the Ny'alotha raid. If it's orange, it comes from some type of Mythic Plus, right? Whether it's Gatiku, which you're gonna farm from Mythic Plus, or you can get from your weekly cache for it to be, you know, 10 eye levels higher, that'd be even better. And then the only other thing is the chest piece is the Azerite piece that you actually want from Mythic Plus because it is better than the one in the raid. And then the biggest thing here is that Mechagon is now gonna be a Mythic Dungeon in Season 4 in the upcoming week, right? So that means all of the loot that you can get from Mechagon are now going to be available to get from Mythic Plus, and you can just spam those and farm those. Biggest note there is, of course, the 2 rings. Whatever combination you want, whether it's Loop of Division or Loop of Recursion, one is just if you hit the guy from behind, the other one is if you hit the guy 3 times. And then the proc that you combine it with is either Overclocking Bitband or Snorting Bitband. One just gives you a bunch of haste, and then the other one does a damage proc. So right now, the best simming is the Logic Loop of Division and Overclocking Bitband. Now, the way that these rings work is that you do need 2 of them, right? Just having 1 ring doesn't do anything. It's just a stat number. So once you do have both rings, they do become best in slot, right? If you don't have the best rings, then you're kind of just going whatever other ring you have. It doesn't really matter. For a lot of these pieces, of course, if you get corruption on the gear themselves, that definitely, you know, changes their value. The list that you see right now is avoiding and kind of ignoring corruption, right? Corruption just changes the value of an item completely. So for example, if you don't have both mythic rings, you can switch over to this best in slot Ny'alotha only gear, and this will only tell you the best in slot gear from the raid itself. Now, I put all 3 weapons on here because initially it doesn't really matter. As long as you get the higher eye level weapon, it most likely will be a benefit. But there is the one caveat is that Gatiku is very, very strong. Even my current one, which is eye level 450, that beats all the 475 weapons in the raid, right? So that beats the Skolvaz and the Hellshed weapons. Imagine if you get a 465, it'll easily beat the raid weapons. But you do only want 1, so ideally the best in slot would be to hold a Devastator's Hour from the last boss in the raid, and then a Gatiku in your offhand. So you're going to be farming a lot of King's Rest, and you're going to be farming a lot of both of the Mechagon dungeons, right? They're going to be split between the Junkyard and the Workshop, and you need to do both because each one drops the 1 set of the rings. This also makes it very easy for you to think about what you want to buy from the Mythic Plus vendor. You really just buy the chest. And if you get the chest on the first week, great. Now you have the best in slot, right? Even if you don't, the raid chest isn't that bad, but Just so you know, if you're going to gamble anything on the Mythic Plus vendor, it's really just going to be the chest. And then as far as for Azerite traits, I mean, nothing really changes too much in regards to what you want. You still want 3 Cold Steel Hot Blood, you want 1 Unbridled Ferocity, and that right here I labeled it as high priority. Once you get that, you're kind of good to go. Heart of Darkness is now the new trait from the raid. All it does is that if you're above a certain amount of corruption, you get a bunch of secondary stats. It's okay. The sims on it, I'm not fully confident if it's working perfectly, but right now it's simming okay enough for you to take, but it's basically tied with like Reckless Fury, Simmering Rage, Blightborn Fusion. Like these ones are all kind of all the same, right? And similarly on this side, the next ring of traits, so Overwhelm Power is no longer the blatant OP. Unstable Flames, Overwhelm Power, Gut Ripper are all kind of even. I actually think sometimes Gut Ripper will sim higher and sometimes Unstable Flames sim higher. It kind of just depends on your gear, obviously. If you need, crit, if you're low on haste, for example, or if you have enough of the stats and you just want more damage with Gut Ripper. And then you can always take Heed My Call and Elemental Whirl. And then of course the call out there is that Heed My Call does AoE. So in situations where you're doing AoE content like Mythic Plus, or if you care about some type of the AoE fights, then Heed My Call can rise in value. And then of course the essences, even though Condensed Nightfires got nerfed, I think twice. It got nerfed in like 2 different aspects. It gives you less of a damage buff, and the guy casts slower. It is still the best major, even with the nerf. So if you haven't gotten the rank 3, make sure you go back to the raid this week, I guess, and go get it. The miners, Breath of the Dying is one of the new miners coming out, and it does insane damage as the miner. The miner basically does the same damage as the major together right now. I think probably because there's got to be some APL changes for using it, but it's very, very strong. Especially once you get rank 3, it just cranks out damage during execute phase. And then the next is just Crucible Flame, Conflict and Strife. Now, any of the miners that I talk about, if you do want to use World Ring Resonance, you totally can, as long as there's a few people using it in a raid. And then as far as how valuable it is, it kind of just depends. It's kind of tied with these ones. These are the ones, so I have it kind of there as substitute, but you don't really have to like try to go get it. But if you do want to play with it, definitely it is there. Especially if there's somebody else in a raid and it really benefits them, and you using them will help them too. Feel free to take it in that situation. As far as for AoE, Blood Enemy, I think is the best essence there. And then for the miners, Purification Protocol is the other must-have. The rest of them doesn't really matter. I just put Conflict and Strife and Breath of the Dying there. But realistically, it's really just Blood Enemy and Purification Protocol that matters there. Now, their potions are the same. It doesn't change. Same with all the other consumables. So Unbridled Fury single target, Empower Proximity for AoE. And then, if you guys are curious, like what Azerite pieces that I sim making this list, it's all down here below. You guys are going to scroll down. You can see all the ones that get picked, right? So triple Cold Steel Hot Blood, you got 1 Unbridled Ferocity, and then you got 1 Reckless Flurry, and you can kind of see like Gut Ripper, and I think that's Elemental Whirl. And then stat weights is kind of interesting. So there is going to be a lot of stuff that like gives you haste. You can see that, right? Because you have Furious Slash, and then depending on whether you have the Mechagon Rings, the haste trinket from the raid, your stat weights will obviously change. So the same caveat as always, only use stat weights as just like a preview, right? Stat weights itself shouldn't be the end all be all in your gear. But if you guys are curious right now with this like end game setup, right? My best stat would be crit, second, third, fourth, basically verse, mastery, haste. It kind of just changes it around. Right now, haste is actually the lowest out of them. And then as far as corruption gear is concerned, as I talked about in the previous video, right? There's still a lot of changes happening to corruption gear at the moment, right? The past week, Infinite Stars got nerfed. So just heads up on that, right? But even with the nerf, Infinite Stars does seem to be the highest simming corruption, right? So it takes basically my DPS, with the end game gear, 71,000 DPS over a 5-minute fight, bumps that up to 89,000 DPS. So it is a significant improvement in the damage, right? If you look at the gear, it's exact same gear. All I'm changing is the corruption that's on there. So it's definitely still very strong at the moment. Of course, next is Echoing Void, Twilight Devastation, and Twisted Appendage. If you guys click the link that's at the bottom of the corruption gear, you'll see like this Raybots window, and you can kind of just like hover over each one and it'll tell you exactly which corruption. I tried putting every single corruption here. I think there's one missing. That one doesn't really matter, but you can kind of scroll down and see like all the corruption that you can get there. So that's that. Hopefully you guys get your Infinite Stars very quickly, or Echoing Void if Infinite Stars gets nerfed too much. And then just quickly coming over here in the tab that's just for the raid gear, you can kind of see like what the item is and what bosses drops them, and there's like a counter right there of how many best in slot loot comes from each boss, right? Drastagath, whatever it is, does have the highest number, but of course Ny'alotha the Corruptor, Carapace, and N'Zoth will still be pretty important for you to roll on, just so you can get the Azerite pieces. And of course N'Zoth drops the big weapon that you really want. Raw Den is pretty important to point on too, because he does have 3 items. One of them is going to be the trinket. Now, in regards to the trinket, I do want to say this Void Twisted Titan Shard sims very, very poorly, but I wouldn't be surprised if one, if the sims isn't working perfectly on this trinket, and two, if Blizzard doesn't end up buffing this. The part that might not be simming perfectly, I don't know if the equip effect from having both trinkets is being simmed correctly, and two is I would be very surprised if Blizzard doesn't make it stronger, because it really makes sense for that set to be strong. So for example, if I can just show you guys, Raw Den, he is here. So the set equip is while Ny'alotha, your spells and abilities have a chance to draw an orb of Vita and Void towards you. Collecting the orb increases your strength by 965 for 15 seconds. I'm not sure if that's being done correctly. The only thing I will say, however, is that this Void Twisted Titan Shard, even if they do buff it, it might still be kind of bad, because in order for you to get that crit you can see in the equip, you get an 80k absorb shield for 15 seconds. Now 80k damage is very, very easy to break. I'm sure there's going to be lots of AoE just taking damage in random fights that just you can't avoid. On top of that, as you start weighing more and more corruption, you're just going to be dealt damage from your corruption effects, and that shield is going to go on very, very quickly. So, you know, if this trinket is simming poorly, it might be even worse when you actually use it, but heads up on that. And then the other call out I wanted to make is this trinket, the Rithing segment of Dressagat from boss that dropped a lot of loot. And has a very complicated name, but basically this is the first on-use trinket that I think of that actually does AoE damage without splitting damage in this expansion. There might be one or two I'm thinking of, like there's the one that like does the poison dots, but this is just the on hit, you press it once, it does an AoE damage. That's pretty significant, right? Because most of the other things that you've seen in this expansion, for example, like the stuff we talked about, the corruption, right? The Echoing Void corruption or Gorong's trinket, whatever, those all split damage, but this is pretty important that it doesn't. So you might still want this just so you can blast pretty hard in Mythic Plus and AoE. And yeah, that's basically it for the gear guide for this patch and this season and this raid. And once again, this document will be linked down in the description below, so let me know what you guys think. And of course, if anything changes, I will update the stuff in the sheet. So like if there's something that's wasn't simming correctly, if we need to change the value of the trinkets, then we'll change that, right? So I think the things that will actually change is the trinkets, the 1 and 2 trinkets, and then the corruption. And then the corruption will just be based on like how Blizzard is nerfing it. They're going to nerf Infinite Stars more, if they're going to nerf Echoing Void more, if they're going to buff some of the other ones. Oh, and then of course, I know that on Blood Mallet right now, the Intellect trinket is simming the highest. I mean, I don't think that's going to be the way when the raid launches. If Blizzard actually lets that go through, and it stays that way, if the Intellect trinket stays the Benson slot trinket for literally every single class, that's kind of a problem. So I didn't put it here, but just know that that's a thing right now. And I don't think that's going to continue in the future, but we'll see. You never know. As always, thanks for checking out the video, guys. Feel free to subscribe to see more. See ya.